What's up, guys? I'm here today with my good friend Ben Norton, and today we will be talking about whether or not you should study in China. And there's going to be two components to this. One is whether children, if you have children, they should study here in China. And then the other aspect is university. So it's going to be kind of a joint conversation because Ben is thinking about staying here in China for the long term and potentially together with his wife here having kids. And so you're naturally going to have some questions about kids going to school in China. And I have 5 kids ranging from 13 to 3. You've met them all. So you can ask me some questions about that. And then obviously, especially for my eldest son, as he gets ready for university, I'm also wondering, where should he be going to university? Should it be in China? And since Ben is doing his PhD here, I'm going to be able to ask him some questions. So I think a good place to start would probably be talking about kids. And with that, welcome to the show, Ben, and we can start our discussion.
Thanks for having me, Daniel. It's a pleasure being here in this nice studio. We did another video walking around Chongqing, and we talked about the migration of people from TikTok to Xiaohongshu. I mean, there are a lot of exciting things happening. And I think actually that's the perfect symbol of the kind of future of China and its relations with other countries. China is becoming more and more important. It has the largest economy in the world. It's the world's leading industrial superpower. It produces everything. Now it's catching up in cutting-edge technologies, electric vehicles, phones, semiconductors. So, of course, for people who are interested in education, China is becoming a major area of interest. You know, one of the advantages the U.S. had for many decades is it had top universities. But increasingly, China is becoming the home to many of the world's top universities. I know we'll talk about that in a moment.
Yeah, exactly.
But just a really brief summary is that now China is the #1 country for producing scientific research. Chinese universities have scholars that produce more scientific articles than any other country. So there are so many exciting things happening.
Yeah,
but
for sure.
before we get to that, I'll ask you a few questions because, I've only been in China now for about 1.5 years.
Yeah.
And I'll be here several years at least because I came here to do a PhD and to learn about China. So at least 4 or 5 years, hopefully longer. But you've been here 16 years.
Right.
16. So can you talk about why you ended up staying in China? I know you were involved in doing trade and business, and you ended up loving it and staying here. And now you have 5 kids who have studied in China. So can you talk about your experience?
Yeah, so I mean, I came here originally for business, and my businesses have gotten to a point where we could pretty much relocate anywhere we wanted. And, sending them to school in Canada back home was a consideration in the beginning. But we ultimately decided that China was a really good place to raise them. And maybe I'll start with why I think that. Just the environment here in China, even when you talk to young people here, I found that ironically, even though, of course, everybody knows there's censorship here because it's more overt. There's censorship in the West also, but it's not as in your face. And because the censorship is so overt here, I feel like it's produced a generation of people who understand that if they want the full story, there's all different kinds of stories out there, and it's in your. If they basically type in www.youtube.com, they can't get it, right? They can't get to youtube.com.
Although it's easy to get a VPN.
It is, and they do, but that's what they know. They say, okay, there are certain controls in place, and I've got to broaden my perspectives in various ways. Whereas in the West, they come to their conclusions with the assumption that they've been given total freedom, and they've come to those conclusions after seeing the whole story and carefully considering it with their own kind of thought process, which is not the case. You're manipulated into certain opinions, ideas. Obviously, that's becoming a lot more obvious with the bogus reasons they're blocking, TikTok, which has created this rush of people over to Xiaohongshu. But
who are all surprised at how actually people in China, many have great lives. And this idea in the West that China's horrible and everyone's in poverty.
Exactly.
I mean, they think that they have this freedom of thought and freedom of expression, but in reality, the little bubbles that many people are in are very small, and their perspectives are actually broadening as they see more of a country like China, and they realize, wow, I have been lied to.
Yeah, exactly. And so what it ends up creating is it creates a population here, especially amongst the young population, who are far more aware of how the world actually works and who are far more educated about global politics than somebody in the West who has been kind of manipulated into their position without realizing it. So there is one where I think that they will get a better global perspective from China, as ironic and as difficult as that may be for somebody to accept, because they have these preconceived notions about China. Then there's obviously the safety element. For my kids, from when they were 8, 9 years old, 10 years old, they go out, ride their bikes by themselves outside. And I know you get that in some places in the West, but overall, the safety factor in China is really high. And when you hear from women in China, especially if they're foreign women who come over and who are used to having to be really careful when they go out at night, they say the same thing. They can't believe.
I've heard that so many times.
Yeah. And that is also a sense of freedom in itself, because the government has a responsibility to create a safe environment for its people. And so a lot of these people, they end up feeling more free in China. And there's so many other stories that I can share about just your daily life in China, where actually where it matters, you're more free here. Even my dad, when he came over, we took them on an RV trip, my dad and my mom, up to Qinghai, up to the Tibetan Plateau. And all of these different experiences, whether it be, not being afraid of police on the street when you're on the highway, where my mom says, oh, careful, make sure you're not speeding. I'm like, they don't really catch you for these little things, And also parking our RV wherever we wanted, parking it in service stations.
Just on the police thing before you move, it's a funny story that I've heard from multiple people, but I only been here a year and a half, but I've seen, especially often older Chinese, argue with police all the time. It's so funny because I come from the U.S., which is supposedly this great free country, and everyone's afraid of police, especially people of color. They would never yell at a police officer because they could get shot. Every year in the U.S., over 1,000 people on average are killed by police. And in China, it's so funny seeing all these, grandmas always yelling at the police.
Yep.
And the police, which are often these younger men, are very trying to calm them down, very calm. It's so funny. And you're like, wait, which is the police state? The police here don't have any guns.
Yeah.
They always have these human catchers. They're really funny. They're like these little net things. I don't even know what you call them, like a hook.
Yeah.
That's what they have. They're not all just walking around with arms at all times like in the U.S. And of course, not even to mention, you talk about security. I mean, mass shootings never happen in China, whereas in the U.S. they're unfortunately happening on average.
Yeah,
2 times a day.
exactly. I mean, for such a big country, when you look at these small incidents that happen, I mean, it's overall one of the safest places you can raise your kids, or just even for yourself. And no, on the police thing, yeah, you are far more likely to see ordinary people yelling at police here than the other way around. And I mean, to be honest, I've actually even done it, and I've had to remind myself. I said, you know what? When I go back home, I got to remember I can't do this anymore. Like, for example, here in Chongqing, they started this campaign to check for illegally modified motorbikes, because some of them have been racing around at night, creating a lot of noise pollution. And so they set up shop under this one particular bridge where they stop all the motorcycles to check them, to see if they've been illegally modified, to make sure you have your motorcycle license and everything like that. And it's usually very quick, but because they were told they needed to do this, they just set up in this one convenient spot that's really easy to stop people. And if it's raining, they're under the cover of the bridge and stuff like that. But they set up there for so many days that I got stopped like 3 or 4 times. And every time I got to show show my license. They quickly take a picture of my bike, make sure it's not illegally modified. And then on 2 occasions, I had to sign something that said, if my bike is over 160 cc, which it is, it's 750 cc, I promise not to kind of race around at night and make noise, because they're thinking about the community, because they obviously got complaints from the community.
And there are people who do that.
There are.
I mean, I live in Beijing and I've seen it.
Yeah. But then I took my helmet off, and I was really annoyed at them. I'm like, listen, you're here every single day at the same spot at the same time. Every single day, you're going to get the same people. This is the 3rd time you've stopped me. Don't you think it would be a better idea to? And the response was, I'm really sorry. Thank you for your understanding. You know, this is just something we got to do because there's been racing and stuff like that. So thank you for your understanding. And that was a natural thing for me. But as I was driving off, I was thinking, damn, you know what? I've been here for 16 years. I've got to remember when I go back that this is not something you can do in the West. But no, I mean, so general freedom where it actually matters is a big thing. And
which is not even to mention, I mean, freedom from want. Just a quick note, because when FDR was U.S. president in the New Deal, he famously talked about the 4 freedoms. One of those 4 freedoms was not just freedom of expression, etc. Freedom from want. That is, being in poverty is not a form of freedom.
Right.
Having access to a basic, dignified life with food and a roof over your head. And I mean, this is of course not the main topic, but just to mention it, like the fact that you've been here 16 years, I've been here only a year and a half, but I still have never seen a homeless person. And you've seen the changes and the poverty alleviation, hundreds of millions of people being lifted out of poverty. I mean, that's a form of freedom. Like, if you have the actual means to provide a basic dignified life, that gives you more freedom. Whereas if you have to live paycheck to paycheck, work 2 or 3 jobs, you can barely get enough food for your family, that's not freedom.
Right.
Even if you can go online and say whatever crazy stuff you want.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that was one of the responses where some of the users from TikTok went onto Xiaohongshu and asked, what's your impressions about America and Americans? And one of the top responses was, you guys have the freedom to complain, but not the freedom to change anything. And this is one of the things that Eric Lee famously said too. In America, you can change the parties, but you can't change the policy. In China, you can't change the party, but you can change the policies.
Yep.
And that's what I've seen. It's just this continual improvement. Everything is moving so quickly, and the society is actually improving, where I feel like a lot of things have stagnated in the West. Or if you look at the political discourse and where it's gone now, it's almost as if people are nurtured to just work against each other. Whereas here, there is this sense of community where everybody's working towards common goals. And so just that dynamic is just only a few of the reasons why I think this is just such a great place to live and also to raise children.
Yeah, well, just a brief note on the subject of social media moderation, censorship, content moderation. In the West, they call it content moderation because it sounds nicer than censorship, but it exists in the West, of course, and in other countries. I mean, Facebook is constantly working with foreign governments to censor, like Israel does this all the time, India does this. So it's not like China is unique in this content moderation and censorship. But in the context of social stability, which for China is one of the most important things, maintaining social stability so they can develop, so people can have better, safer lives. I mean, look at social media in the US and the role, and then also Canada, which you're from, and some parts of Europe. Look at the role it's played in completely dividing and polarizing society. And politicians are more and more incentivized to just hate the other side completely, even though they often agree in many policies, right? So look in the US, where you have politicians constantly talking about the possibility of a civil war.
Right.
And what is the role of social media in intentionally inflaming that hostility, because you get more followers, you get more, even if someone hates you, like they're still commenting, they're still subscribing. There's no such thing as, a bad PR or whatever, in terms of getting more subscribers and views. Whereas in China, their view is completely different. Their view is that we want to make sure that there is not instability, that there's not this polarization and hostility. We want to encourage more harmony. And so, there are many examples. We could spend hours. I know you want to talk about education, but the quick note is just that, for instance, we were talking recently about how there are these myths about repression of Muslims in China, and how China does have many millions of Muslims who are treated as equal Chinese citizens that have equal rights, and there are 56 ethnic groups officially recognized by China and guaranteed autonomy and things like that. And you pointed out that there are some average people in China who have expressed some of these bigoted views. There's 1.4 billion people. You're going to get, and what happens is, so not only are extremists, like Islamic extremists, yes, they are censored, but also Islamophobes are censored.
Exactly.
So we only hear in the West about the tactics taken against extremists, which exist in every society. There are extremists, right? But yes, there's censorship of some of these extremist groups and such, and they're not allowed to operate. But also, if you are a person in China and you're saying things demonizing Muslims and trying to cause this social instability and saying they're not real Chinese, and then you'll be censored as well, because the goal is overall social harmony and preventing that kind of hatred and instability that we constantly see social media fomenting in the West.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. It was more specifically about Islamophobes in China towards ethnic minorities here. So whether it's Hui or Uyghur, again, over 1 billion people, you're going to get some people who are bigoted. And so what they did was they were censoring people who are Islamophobic, and it had specific implications for ethnic minorities in China.
And there are 55 ethnic minorities, and then the Han. Yeah. And they're officially, so when they talk about in China, the term is 中华民族, which is the Chinese nation. When they say that, they don't just mean Han, they mean 56 ethnic groups. So it's one thing that's not known about China. It's actually a very diverse country.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And so that's why they censored it too, to say, okay, no, this is going to create hatred towards these groups, which is counterintuitive if, China was supposedly targeting these Muslims or wanted them to have wanted to do anything other than protect them. And then so, but it's always a battle because they have to figure out, okay, well, we still want to allow as much freedom of expression as possible while creating this censorship that kind of creates harmony or whatever it is. And so
prevents social instability.
Right. And so what they ended up doing, those Islamophobes, was they then started speaking about Muslims in Europe. They started saying negative things about Muslims in Europe, which there was a little bit more freedom for because it didn't have direct implications it wasn't really talking about specific ethnic minority groups in China, but that was kind of their way to go around it. So it's this continual balancing act of how to kind of manage this situation to make sure that the society here lives in harmony.
Yeah, and this is one of those points that's often not known outside of China, which is that obviously, yes, this censorship does exist. Again, it exists in other countries as well, but in China, they're very clear about it. They're open about the censorship. But what's funny is when you spend time here, you realize that there are many clever ways people find to get around it. So, this idea, again, that China is like unique and authoritarian and repressive, I mean, it's not true. And if you spend some time here in China, you can start to see that the situation is much more nuanced.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. No, so I mean, those are some of the reasons. I mean, I guess that covers not only why I like kind of raising my children here. Again, only a few. There's many other reasons, but that covers why myself I like living in China and why I like my children growing up here too. I think that they manage to focus on their education. They get a surprisingly global view, and it's a society that's working together. So more of a collaborative mindset is instilled in them rather than this kind of, I would imagine if somebody from here, a child, moved to the West afterwards, they would just look at the division. Either they might get caught up in it and descend into it, or just kind of step back. And if they were in a position to change anything, they say, guys, we should be working together. Especially my son, my eldest son, his main thing is science, but he's really into politics and everything like that too. So if one day he gets involved in that, I think the political awareness and principles and the values that he gains from here would be very useful for him in the future if he did eventually go in that direction. But yeah, and I guess, there's many different types of schools and things like that. I don't know if you had specific, because you've got a potential idea to have children here. So I don't know if you had any other specific.
I have so many questions. Yeah. I'll ask you one in a second, but just another topic that we didn't talk about why people end up coming to China and staying. We talked about security and many other things. Another is simply cost. I mean, I'm from the US originally, you're from Canada. Housing costs are insanely expensive. The cost of living in general, healthcare, and education is part of this as well, right? So one of the advantages is that China is so affordable. And this is something that's really surprising to a lot of people when they come here. I mean, it's just really amazing how affordable. I can't imagine raising 5 kids in the West.
And a lot of people always say, because when you compare like the food prices, even for imported foods, like the prices we get, like cherries and all this kind of stuff. We bought some cherries from South America. I can't remember the exact price, but we were just blown away by how cheap they were. And a lot of people always say, well, that's because people in China don't make that much also. And it's true, the average GDP is lower, but actually when you look at GDP as the purchasing power parity under PPP, they can still actually live a better quality life, even when you take that into consideration.
Because in the U.S., I mean, technically paychecks on paper. There's also the exchange rate issue. The U.S. dollar is really, really overvalued, and the U.S. is constantly accusing China of undervaluing its currency, the renminbi or the yuan, because the U.S. claims that China does this on purpose to make its exports more competitive. But meanwhile, the U.S. dollar is so extremely expensive, which means that, okay, so if you do the exchange rate, it looks like paychecks are smaller in China or many other countries.
Yep.
But when you actually look at the cost of living in the U.S., people make more money, but they spend so much money on health insurance, and then they get denied coverage anyway. Yeah. They spend so much money on education, on transportation, because there's basically no public transportation. Here it's extremely good and it's very cheap. So yeah, you have to think about those things together.
Yeah, for sure. And of course, there are places you could point to in cities which are expensive in terms of housing, and the idea of buying a property in like the major city
Yeah, the
centers
tier one cities
is crazy. Chongqing is very, very reasonable. But outside of that, kind of if you average it out, you're right. It's you can have a high quality life here.
Well, this is also why the government popped the real estate bubble, because they recognize, as President Xi said, houses are for living and not for speculation. And then you see in the Western media, they say, well, now China's in an economic crisis because its real estate sector is collapsing. Well, which do you want? Do you want to criticize China for having this huge real estate bubble, which it had in the major cities? They call the tier one cities, very expensive housing. So they popped the bubble and now they're in crisis. Whatever. We all know the double standards. But so we talked about some of the other factors: cost of living, security, public transportation, things like that, which are also forms of freedom, right? Like if you have the freedom to get on the train and to go wherever, and it's like 4 yuan, like 50 cents to go on the subway, then you have the kind of freedom of mobility that you might not have in some parts of the US where you have to have a car, you have to spend money on gas. And so let's talk about education now.
Okay.
So you have 5 kids here.
Yep.
This is something that a lot of people like me who have spent a little time in China and we're thinking about maybe staying here longer term.
Yep.
After I finish my PhD and things like that, I'm thinking maybe it would be a nice place. And one thing that's kind of hard to figure out is if you want to have kids in China, how will they be educated? Because especially if you're not Chinese or married to a Chinese person, it might limit the options your kids have for studying. So can you talk about the different options that exist and why you decided what you chose to do?
So there are obviously the public schools, which would be the cheapest option, and the regulations from city to city or province to province might vary in terms of how a foreign child would get into a public school. But there is a way, and I know other families who both parents are from outside of China and their kids are in a public school. I don't know exactly how that works, but there is a way, even if it's a little bit complicated to get through. Then
that would be Chinese.
That would be a full-on Chinese school. They do have English lessons, which are mandatory also, but pretty much it's going to be mostly in Chinese. Then there are private bilingual schools, which are somewhere in the middle. They do have English content, Chinese content. It'll be more expensive than going to just a regular public school, but still considerably cheaper than a international school. And you will get Chinese local kids with a Chinese passport who go there, and it will still be closer to a public education format, which is very rigorous. Then you have the international schools. So you have various international schools that either follow, the American curriculum, the British curriculum. The one that my kids are going to is IB, and it's mostly a British curriculum.
I think there are also like some Korean schools and
Japanese. There are. There's a big Korean population here in Chongqing, actually. And so we chose, and we went into, because obviously my eldest is 13 years old now, we chose the international schools because I looked at the pressure that existed in the public schools, and it was huge. It was just too much.
This has been a big issue recently in China that they're trying to deal with.
They're trying to deal with it. But back then, when we were looking at the options, and we saw these kids in public school staying up until 11 o'clock at night, doing their homework, or they get out of school at 8 p.m. or something like that, but they finish their homework at school. I was like, these kids don't have a chance to be kids.
Yeah.
It's just, it's too much. And
this is something that I've seen, to be fair, I mean, it is a real problem in China that they're dealing with.
Yeah.
But to be fair, it's not just China. This is a problem in East Asia in general, in South Korea and Japan.
Absolutely.
There's so much pressure, always studying, always doing homework, no free time for kids. And I agree that, this is why recently the government here in China has taken some actions to try to stop private tutoring, which also creates inequality and unequal access because only some families can afford private tutors. But it's also because kids just have too much pressure on them. So the government's trying to take some action, but it's still...
They definitely have reduced it. The public schools, in the middle schools, they have heavily reduced the amount of homework. They just knew the pressure was too much. But you're right. It is an East Asia thing. There's that person in the U.S. that wrote the famous book about tiger moms, and there's this stereotype. And actually, even the international school that we went to, because when you get to full-on international schools, you need a foreign passport in order to get into them. But there are a lot of Chinese who had their children overseas or have an ID card overseas, and so they can get in. But what we found in our school in Shenzhen was that there were a lot of Chinese parents whose kids were born overseas, and they were actually trying to pressure the school, even though it was an international school and was supposed to have far less pressure than the public school, not by design, but just by nature. And they were pressuring the school to give more homework to the kids. And I was like, oh no, come on, man! This is why we chose the international school. So they weren't, but that is the mentality here. Yeah. And you can kind of understand it. I mean, this is a society, when you look at what they came from 20, 30 years ago, and all of the opportunities, all of the things that happened, there is this mindset that we need to do as well as we can right now to grab whatever opportunities there are and to really take advantage of this booming economy. And maybe it will slowly kind of become a little bit more relaxed later, but that was always an issue. But after the government here started addressing this issue and they started reducing the homework load, if I were to rethink again from the beginning, would I send them to an international school or a bilingual school? A bilingual school is considerably cheaper than the international school, and also they'd get more of a Chinese education.
And most of their classmates would be Chinese, whereas obviously with, we are obviously foreigners in China, so it makes sense that we're talking about international schools, but, only a very small minority of kids go to the international schools.
Yep.
So if you want your kids to be with other, mainland Chinese students, that would be
well, that actually reminds me of another reason why they're here, which I forgot to mention, was because being here in China and learning Chinese and being part of the society here, I do feel that a lot of the best opportunities in the future will be with China in some capacity, whether it be in China or whether it be, doing something with all of these other countries that are starting to engage China more. I just think this is a really good place to get an education because they have a bright future ahead of them. Yeah. And so for those two reasons, for cost and for getting more of a Chinese experience, I'm not sure I would choose an international school again. I might choose the bilingual school. But the thing is if your kids start out in a bilingual school, it's easy to move to an international school because you're kind of going down in pressure. It's becoming a little bit more relaxed, a little bit more, soft skills and things like that. But it's very difficult to go in the other direction. Yeah. If they've started in the international schools and then you want to send them to a public school or a bilingual school, that is a very hard transition.
In terms of the workload, but especially the language.
Workload, language, the type of learning culture, the things they focus on. It still is a lot of kind of, it relies a lot on, from what I've seen, is memory-based study also and things like that. Again, it is changing slowly. But now that they're in this system, I'm kind of keeping them there. And the other advantage, too, is that they have holidays that the public schools don't, like, during Christmas and stuff like that. So when we travel during those periods, you don't get that huge rush in China for all the tourist sites and things like that.
Traveling during Chinese New Year, I learned the hard way, is the worst time.
Oh, yeah. So we get a bunch of different holidays, which allow us to explore places in China without the big rush. And we have an RV here. We love driving out and exploring places. So those are kind of the three choices. If I was in your position, what I would probably do is I would probably at least first send them to a bilingual school.
Yeah.
And I would start there. And then, depending on how things go, or after they get a really good foundation in Chinese. I mean, my kids speak Chinese, but they would have an even greater foundation if they went to a bilingual school.
Well, but also speaking, like you speak Chinese very well, but also speaking Chinese is different from reading and writing Chinese as a native speaker, right? Because Chinese is very difficult.
Yeah.
And the thing about Chinese, as someone who's studying it now, it's kind of almost, if you're learning it as a foreigner, it's kind of like two separate languages, because you have the written language, which is not phonetic, right? I mean, there are many beautiful things about Chinese characters, and there are things that are related, but mostly it's not phonetic. I mean, there are certain characters that you can kind of guess the pronunciation, but you kind of have to learn that separately. So you can speak Chinese really well, but not read and write well.
No, that's my weakness. And that would be, I mean, my kids are doing both. They're reading, writing, and speaking, but for sure they'd be even stronger in it if they were going to the bilingual school.
And if you go through the Chinese public system, which obviously the vast majority of people in China do because they're native Chinese speakers, you would have to take some of the very difficult exams, like famously the Gaokao, which is the final exam people take before university. And the level of Chinese, it's not just about being smart, right? It's about the level of your command of the Chinese language. And that would be very challenging, I think, for a student that did not go through all of the public system.
Very challenging. And I'm not exactly sure about the rules about going from an international school into the Chinese universities. There was some sort of a loophole or a rule where you had to do your last 2 years of high school or 2 years of schooling outside of the country. Even in Hong Kong is fine, outside of the mainland, I should say.
If you want to apply,
if you want to apply as a foreign student. Otherwise, they might still have to go through the Gaokao. So that's something I need to look at, and I think things are changing, but that's also one consideration. But yeah, so to finish that off, I would start with bilingual, and then if the pressure was too much, or you thought that, international is still more suitable, then I would migrate them to an international after. And no matter what, you can't go wrong with that setup, because they're still going to get an amazing foundation in Chinese. You start out with something a little bit more difficult, and then you can go to something that's, probably going to have a lot less pressure. And again, it's changing. It's changing rapidly, though. So maybe the bilingual schools will be even closer to an international school level of pressure for kids by the time you're ready. I don't know. We have to see where it goes.
Yeah, I was going to say 2 points. One, it also really depends on where in China you are, right? Because, we are in pretty big cities. So especially Beijing is a very international city, or if you're in Shanghai or Shenzhen, where there are a lot of foreigners, you obviously have more options and more flexibility. Whereas if you're in smaller cities, there are fewer options.
Right.
That's something to consider. But also, the other point I was going to make is that, so it's a complicated situation, because clearly there is a lot of pressure on students. The government has recognized that. They're trying to reduce it, trying to allow them a little more flexibility in their lives to be kids. But at the same time, I mean, I personally wouldn't want kids to go through that, but you can't argue with the results either. So this is the argument they make, is that, look, China is leading the world in all of the different, whatever you look at the statistics for, scientific knowledge, mathematical skills. I mean, if you compare students' performance on different exams and such around the world, China is consistently at the top. And of course, mainland China in these statistics are often, it's divided from, Hong Kong, which is obviously part of China, but consistently, mainland China, Hong Kong, always at the top of the results. But of course, you do have to say, I would want my kids to have the best possible education, but I don't want them to just burn out so young. Like that's an issue. Yeah,
for sure. And I wonder if with the advent of AI, it will change the balance of things, where the emphasis on computerized level understanding and memorization and processing ability will become less of a priority, and it will free people up to focus on whatever it is, the soft skills, or at least having the proficiency to interact with AI in a way to get the results that you want. I mean, I think this is going to be a really big game changer. Yeah, I mean, we have to see where it goes. Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe we should talk about the university system.
So that is my big curiosity. My son, he has it. He had it in his head before that he wanted to do his last few years of high school in the U.S. He's really interested in astrophysics and sciences, even though he does a lot of political stuff as well. And he changed his mind after. He realized that, he has it pretty good here, and the teachers at his current school have realized his abilities, so they've given him a lot of opportunities. Like, for example, he did this pitch for the school to buy 3D printers and things like that, and they accepted his pitch and gave him a budget to buy 3D printers, and now he's running the 3D printer course. After school, he's teaching the other students to do 3D printing. He did this Model UN thing where he had to represent Belgium, and he won best delegation. And now the teachers from the schools in Shanghai who said, how old is this kid? How many times has he done this? First time, he's only 13. He's like, wow. And then they said, we have to send him to Xi'an to do the next one, which is the Security Council, the Model UN Security Council. And he has all of these teachers who have recognized his ability, and he's being given a lot of leadership opportunities. So he's like, why would I leave this? This is like, who knows what kind of attention I'll get or opportunities I'll get in the US. But he still has it in his head that he wants to do university in the West. I think he looks at what has been done historically from people who are coming out of Ivy League universities and things like that. And he's like, this is where I need to be. But he's not really looking at the rate that things are changing in China with universities. And so I just want to find out a little bit more about your experiences, why you chose to study, what your reasons were to study in a Chinese university, and what the differences are between kind of like the English stream and the Chinese stream, because they have two streams in these universities, whether there's any difference in the content or quality, or, just basically a little bit more about your pitch. First of all, your reasons for studying at a Chinese university, your experiences, and what would your pitch be to somebody to say, no, you should really give Chinese universities a strong consideration?
Yeah, well, I'll start by kind of responding to what you mentioned about your son. And I mean, it's true that if you look at the US, especially the US, but also the UK a little bit, Canada a little bit, one of the advantages they still have, despite the many problems they have, is good universities. Especially in the US, you have some of the best in the world, the Ivy League schools. Of course, there are other things that should be considered. One, they're insanely expensive, and they're very competitive. And what happens is you have elites from around the world. One of the reasons that US universities are so good, and also top British universities, Oxbridge, is because they have people, elites from around the world, who go study there. So you have this kind of brain drain. The smartest people with access to resources in many countries, they end up going to Harvard or Oxford, right? So that's an advantage. And this is related to the whole debate about visas in the US and brain drain. It's hurting countries like India, actually, because they lose some of their smartest people. They go study in the US and they end up working in the US for US companies. That hurts India. So that's one of the reasons that the US still has these very good universities. But like you said, things have changed a lot in recent years. So there's no debating that 20, 30 years ago, the US it had the best universities. In China, they've caught up very quickly. Of course, it also depends on your program. But if you are interested, especially in the physical sciences and the hard sciences, China is the best place in the world to study. I mean, if you look at the number of scientific articles in peer-reviewed top journals published by academics by country, China is by far number one, and it's overtaken the US, and it's growing very quickly. Defenders of the US would say, well, the Chinese population is 4 times the size of the US population. That's true. Yep. But also the US has the advantage, again, of this brain drain of bringing in people from around the world. But I'm going to take a look at a list here, and this is published by Nature, which is the leading scientific journal, and they make a list of the top research institutions. So this is the list of the leading scientific institutions in the world, the top 10, according to Nature Journal. 1, Chinese Academy of Sciences, number 1 in the world. Number 2, Harvard University. So looking overall at the institutions, not just the universities, the Chinese Academy of Sciences has beaten Harvard. Number 3, the University of Science and Technology of China. 4, Peking University. 5, Zhejiang University. 6, the University of Chinese Academy of Sciences. 7, the Max Planck Society, which is in Germany. 8, Nanjing University. 9, Tsinghua University. 10, Shanghai Jiao Tong University. So of the top 10, 8 of them are in China. Okay, now let's look at Nature Journal's list of the top academic institutions in the world. These are the top 10. Number 1 is Harvard. So these are the universities, right? Yep. Number 2 is the University of Chinese Academy of Sciences, because the Chinese Academy of Sciences exists, but if you want to study at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, there's a university affiliated with it. But most of the people there are not teachers. They're just researchers. Number 3 is the University of Science and Technology of China. Number 4 is Peking University. 5 is Nanjing University. 6 is Zhejiang University. 7 is Tsinghua. 8 is Sun Yat-sen University. 9 is Shanghai Jiao Tong University. And 10 is MIT. So of the top 10, 8 are in China. Right. 2 are in the US. So things have changed a lot. And so this is focusing on the hard sciences, the physical sciences.
This is exactly what my son is interested in.
So for me, I think it's a no-brainer. He should study, and not just he, many people should, if they want to do real scientific research, come to China to do masters, PhDs, postdocs, and many people are. So in my experience, what I've seen, because my program is international political economy, focused on economics, so it's under the field overall of political science. So that's the social sciences. Now, if you look at the list of social science research, the US and some Western universities are still above Chinese universities, although again, they're catching up. But for the physical sciences, there's no debate. And we're in 2025. Just in a few years, these universities have caught up very quickly in China. I can't imagine what it will be like in 10 or 20 years from now. So I think it's also about thinking in the future. Like people say, oh, well, you know, if I have a degree from Harvard, it's so prestigious. Well, it's like, yeah, it's prestigious now, and it's always going to be prestigious. But think about what a top degree from a Chinese university like Beijing University, Peking University, or Tsinghua, or Fudan University. Think about what that will be like in 10 or 20 years. And I think things are changing a lot, and they will be very prestigious degrees. And also in the quality of education. So like I said, I'm not doing the hard sciences, so I can't really say. I know people, I've met foreign students who are doing PhDs in engineering and physics and chemistry. And those are actually the programs that attract the most international students, which makes sense. Like I said, my program is overall under political science. And there are, of course, a lot of international students. But if you look at the top Chinese universities, most of them have a separate part of their website for international students focused on English language programs.
Right.
Because if you speak Chinese, you can pretty much do any program in China, including at the University of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. As a foreigner, you can study there, but you have to speak Chinese, right? So if you want to look, if you're a foreigner interested in doing graduate work or even undergrad, but especially a master's or a PhD or a postdoc in China, they offer a lot of programs in English. My program's in English. I'm learning Chinese, but my Chinese is not nearly good enough to do the program. So there are a lot of options. What you'll find is if you look at those options, the majority of them are in the physical sciences, engineering, because that's where China is really leading. But there are other options in the social sciences, media, humanities. So in my experience, the programs in English and Chinese are very similar. The rigor is basically at the same level. If you're working in China, because of course they want you to be able to speak Chinese, if you want to get a job in China, they do prefer you doing your program, of course, in Chinese, because if you want to integrate and work in a Chinese company or university and speaking Chinese, they want you to be at that level. But the English language programs are still very prestigious, very well respected. And again, you're doing research. The main point of really doing a PhD, and especially a postdoc, is you're doing research. And you want to be doing research with some of the top scholars in the world. And again, look at these journals. I mean, because in academia, when you think about doing an undergrad, it's very different from doing graduate work. Because if you're doing undergrad, most people are just going to go join an organization, a company, a government. They're not really concerned that much about publishing and getting in top journals and books and things like that. But if you want to be a scientist, a researcher, an academic, you can't argue with the results. I mean, they have some of the best scholars in the world, some of the best research in the world. And again, we need to think about the progress they've made in the past few decades. And there are people who think that China is just going to stay at this level or even go down. But I think that's ignoring all the evidence. All of the evidence shows that China is going to continue advancing and becoming a center of scientific research for the entire world, which we're already seeing, for instance.
It's translating into society itself also.
Electric vehicles, solar panels, these new technologies. I mean, every few months, there's another amazing scientific breakthrough in China, like breakthrough in cancer research, and curing diabetes was one of the recent announcements. So there's this idea, it's very arrogant in the US, where, for instance, the outgoing Biden administration, the Commerce Secretary, Gina Raimondo, she said this openly. She said, we must work with China not with China, the opposite. She said, we must work with Europe to stop China from innovating. She said that. The US goal is to stop China from innovating. Biden said, we will be the most powerful country. China will not overtake us as the most powerful country. It will be us. And so they say, Gina Raimondo also said that we will not allow China to catch up technologically. That they don't want China to innovate. But if you look at what's happening, they're innovating extremely quickly.
Right. Yeah. Everything. I mean, in telecommunications, environmental things. I mean, even just looking at the things that they're able to accomplish in kind of reforesting deserts, and they have this new thing where they are capturing energy in compressed air. I mean, it's just the stuff that's happening here. It makes sense. And also, a lot of Chinese scientists or academics who went overseas, you're starting to see a lot of them come back.
Yeah.
you're seeing a lot of them say, okay, I'm going to be going back to China, whether it be because there's more opportunities here or whether it's because they're feeling less and less welcome in the West, particularly in the U.S. under the current environment.
They're being persecuted by the FBI for bogus reasons.
Yeah, I've got a really good friend of mine who actually specializes in helping Hong Kongers also, because there's a lot of people coming back to Hong Kong, a lot of Hong Kongers to reintegrate and set up their businesses and things like that if they left many years ago or left as a child. And I have a Hong Kong ID card, and I had to get some documents done for my daughter. And whenever you go to these centers, which have been set up to renew your Hong Kong ID card or update it or anything like that, they're absolutely packed. And they're so packed that they've had to open up temporary centers also. So, I mean, it looks like a lot of other people are catching on also. And when you have this talent coming back, when you finally, have all of these people who left as part of the brain drain that was going on in the U.S., it's only going to further contribute towards this progress and to have these brilliant people here doing brilliant things. So, it's not just in the universities you're seeing it, it's in society itself. Because that would be great if, okay, the universities are doing interesting things in sciences and everything like that, but you can actually see it materializing in everyday life also.
Yeah, and really, science is so important in Chinese society. Engineering, the STEM disciplines, right?
Yeah.
And this is, in the West, I say this as someone in the social sciences. In the U.S. in particular, there's this really heavy emphasis on STEM, and it's often done at the expense of other programs, right? But in China, I've never felt that. Like the social sciences programs that I'm doing, and I know other people in, it's not like they're seen as like lesser or inferior. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that there is a strong emphasis on scientific research and innovation. We see this in government policy. So they popped the real estate bubble. And what was the response? The government said, we're going to prioritize the development of high quality new productive forces. That's the term they use. Sometimes they have these, when they're in Chinese, they sound a little more organic. They sound sometimes translated into English a little strange. But the whole point is that they're pushing the limits of innovation, of scientific development, and they want to create all of these new technologies that make people's lives better. Look at, for instance, data on robotization. China is, again, leading the world, and not just China, in East Asia in general. Japan and South Korea are very high, but they're just pushing the limit on so many of these things, and also finding ways to integrate them into everyday life, to make people's lives more comfortable, to make them better, to lift their people further out of poverty. I mean, they've eliminated absolute poverty. 800 million people in China have been lifted out of absolute poverty, which according to the World Bank is 3/4 of all global extreme poverty reduction. But absolute poverty is one thing. Relative poverty is also something they're trying to reduce. And they're pursuing this idea of common prosperity, right? 共同富裕, that's the term they use constantly in China. Common prosperity. And one of the ways they see as to achieve common prosperity is through scientific advancement and becoming a very modern, futuristic society, really. And so I wanted to raise that point. Another point that I want to talk about is the foreign students in China, because I mentioned that my program is in English. Now, I know foreign students doing programs in Chinese.
Yep.
You have to have a very good level of Chinese. So there's a test that people take, which is called the HSK. Mm-hmm. And for many universities, they require HSK 5 or even 6. It's a very high level of Chinese. So my program is in English, so my experience is different. But what I will say is that what's interesting also is if you see the kinds of countries that people are coming from, what's interesting is that President Xi announced that he wanted to encourage more students from the US to come. The president personally said that that's a priority of China. They want to encourage more people from the West. So there are actually a lot of scholarship opportunities. China said that the goal was to have 50,000 US students over 10 years. They didn't get nearly, that's of course, over 10 years, not in 1 year, not 50,000 in 1 year.
Yeah.
So 5,000 per year. They didn't get anywhere nearly close to that. I don't know what the number was for 2024, but I heard that the number for 2023 was around 500 US students, which is crazy when you think about it. I mean, there are so many opportunities, so many scholarships, so many good universities, but because there's a lot of ignorance about China, fear about China, the fear is just completely bogus. I mean, there should not
being undone by this Xiao Hongsu thing, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've never felt afraid in any way. I mean, it's just nonsensical. I definitely felt fear sometimes living in like New York and places where, you know, you can get shot or robbed or whatever. But anyway, so the point is that there's a lot of willingness for people who do want to study in China. There are many opportunities. But what's interesting, I'm not so interested in that, honestly. Like, you know, like you haven't lived in Canada for a long time. I haven't lived in the US for several years, and I have no plans in going back. What's interesting for me politically is also how welcoming China has been to students from the global South.
Yeah.
Because the reason that China is trying to encourage students from the West is they're trying to improve person-to-person relations. That's what they can see clearly that the U.S. government, there's this bipartisan hatred of China, xenophobia. The U.S. is scapegoating China for everything, that even though China has nothing to do with many of these problems in the U.S. Well, so China's response is we want to encourage person-to-person exchange, because if you have people from the US and Europe who come and visit and they see what China's like, they make friends in China, then naturally there will be this kind of organic movement toward trying to improve relations. So for instance, China has also recently reduced restrictions on visa access. So now most people in Europe can come to China for a month without a visa. It makes it very easy. And even in North America, it's becoming a little easier. So again, that's that part of it. And I think a lot of people listening to this will probably be from, you know, English-speaking Western countries. But what's interesting for me, just to talk about the politics of it, is how China is really supporting the global South and is really trying to encourage what they call South-South cooperation, and really prioritizing bringing a lot of students from the global South as well, especially Africa. There are a lot of graduate students from Africa, from all over the continent, who are studying sciences, engineering, public policy, economics, and these are people who are going to go back and work in government or work in universities and, you know, help to develop their country. And this for me has been really rewarding, meeting a lot of people from all over Africa, from Libya, from Eritrea, Ethiopia, Sudan. It's been an amazing experience. South Africa, of course, has a lot of students, and these are people who are very smart. They often speak Chinese super well, way better than me. And these are the people who are going to be the future leaders in these countries, at their home countries in Africa. And it makes me really optimistic as well.
Yeah.
Because obviously for China, it benefits China because these are people who are going to be in government probably, and they'll have a positive view of China. They'll deepen their relations in the future. But it's also genuinely helping some of these poorest countries on earth, right? Now, I spent a lot of time living in Latin America. I'm deeply tied to Latin America. After China, I feel like most at home in Latin America. And unfortunately, that's still something that's really developing because, for a variety of reasons, because during the first Cold War, the U.S. was really controlling a lot of Latin American countries. They had these right-wing military dictatorships. Many of them didn't even have diplomatic relations with China until recently because of that history of U.S. meddling and imperialism. So China's relations with Latin America are pretty new, but even there, we're seeing a huge growth in the number of students coming from Latin America. China and Africa have been close for a long time, right? I mean, this goes back to the 50s and 60s when China supported the anti-colonial movements. So when we look at foreign students in China, there's also that element, which is that it's part of this idea of developing a larger global South community. But like I said, if you're from the West and you're listening to this, I'm not saying that you're excluded, because actually what's happening is that China is saying we're going to give all of these scholarships to people from the global South and to people from the West. The difference is that people in the global South are taking those scholarships. They're like saying, hell yeah, I want to come to China and have a free education, everything paid for, including, you know, you live in a dorm. I mean, it's a small dorm. I'm not going to romanticize the dorms. They're just dorms. But most of these scholarships include everything. Yeah. Includes housing and includes food also. And the food in China is very, very good. One of the best things. I knew food in China would be good, but it's actually even better than I thought. But the point I was going to make is that they're also offering these opportunities to people in the West, and the people in the West are not taking them. There are so many scholarships that are not taken.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, that is going to be the thing that's probably most applicable for this conversation and this video and people listening in, because obviously for the first portion of it, which is kids going to school here, you need to have some sort of a legal status here. You need to be I think maybe if you had, if you were studying here and your kids were here, you could probably do it that way. But in most cases, people who have kids that are going to school here have some sort of a work status here. They're a work visa, or they're working or as a teacher or as in a company here. But this is something that's easier to do, is to come over to these Chinese universities as a student and even seek a scholarship, which is great. I want to backtrack a little bit about the society thing too. Because China is a place that focuses on promoting people from hard sciences also.
Yeah.
And it ends up creating the values of society also, where, you know, if you compare it to a country where you've got kind of, you know, the CEO of or executives from weapons manufacturers or the banking industry that are becoming government officials, your society becomes guided.
Boeing.
Or Boeing.
Boeing used to be run by engineers.
Yeah.
And then they brought in a bunch of finance bros with MBAs with no scientific or engineering background. All they went in was to cut costs, to outsource everything, to break unions. And then what happened? Boeing's making all these horrible planes that are falling out of the sky and breaking down. And whereas in China, it's not just, obviously it's all politics, which you're going to talk about, but all the companies are run by engineers and people with scientific backgrounds.
Yeah, exactly.
Finance bros are not seen well in China. Like they're not, it's not a prestigious job like it is in the West.
No, it's not. And yeah, you see, for example, in the West, you have a lot of people who are brilliant in the sciences or engineering, but then they're just drawn to Wall Street because they can make more money there. Whereas here,
it's the exact opposite.
There was an international event in Urumqi in Xinjiang, and I did a presentation on the sanctions that they were putting against Xinjiang and how it was affecting ordinary people. And I was interested in speaking to international audiences. There were people from Africa, there were people from all over the world, Turkey, Southeast Asia. And they really liked my presentation. Some of them asked me to send it to them afterwards, and I think it made a difference. And while I was there, I managed to shake hands with and I met the party secretary of Xinjiang. And I wasn't really interested. I was like, okay, whatever. You know, I'm not really impressed by that. But then afterwards, the next day, I found out that before he went into politics, he was the head of or very high up in the space agency, China Space Agency, and was the head of the Chang'an 3 mission, which was the first lunar rover, I believe, that went to the moon or to the far side of the moon, whatever it was. Like, this guy was part of that. And I'm like, I like my son, I'm really into kind of space sciences, and I was a big Trekkie. And when I found out that, I was like, oh my God, I wish I got a picture with him. It's like, because they were saying, the people there, they're like, oh, go shake hands with him, shook hands with him, but I didn't ask for a picture or anything like that. Had I known that, I would have asked him so many more questions. I would have taken my picture with him. But that is a common story here, where you get these engineers and these people who are so brilliant, who are being promoted to the top levels of society, and then that ends up guiding your society, that these are their values, is progress and all this kind of stuff.
President Xi himself studied engineering.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing. But yeah, I mean, hopefully, I mean, this thing, we're talking about Xiao Hongsu again, but hopefully this will be, I mean, if you look at all of the effort that China put forward to allow people to have more people-to-people exchanges and understand the real China, this just blows every single effort out of the water, because this has been such a mass event where so many people have suddenly seen the true China or been able to communicate with people here. So hopefully more people from the West also will be looking at Chinese universities as an option.
Yeah, quick note on this thing. I mean, it's funny because, again, I'm in the social sciences, although I originally started undergrad actually as a physics major because I was very interested in the hard sciences, but I was so interested in politics and other things that you have to be really devoted to be a good hard scientist, physical scientist. Yeah. So I was more drawn to the social sciences, which are more pluralist by nature. But the point I was going to make, though, is that, you know, you look at politicians in the US and Canada and many European countries, most of them, they study law, business, maybe economics. Very few of them come from a scientific background. And then you think about their priorities and their policies. Whereas in China, many politicians, of course not everyone, but many do come from the hard sciences, not from law, finance, these kinds of programs that often, especially in the case of law and finance, they inculcate a kind of neoliberal worldview that is often supports the elites of society and not all people, not working people. Whereas, you know, if you're in the hard sciences, you don't necessarily get a view of society of supporting the working class, but you're not you're not ideologically formed in a way that thinks about everything from the perspective of an elite, right? If you do finance, you're thinking about the world from the perspective of 1% of the population. In the case of the US, 93% of stocks are held by 10% of the population. 1% holds 1% holds 50%.
Wow.
So, I mean, when you're studying finance, you're serving those people, right? But if you go from a hard science background and become a politician, again, it's more kind of like a blank slate. I'm not saying that's necessary.
And your priorities are different
yeah.
too. Yeah.
So I think it's just very interesting to think about China in that way. And there are a lot of people who say that, China really is a meritocratic system. It's a meritocracy. And there are people who say that this is not, just China. There are other societies, Singapore, etc. But China really has emphasized that in order to be a politician, you have to work your way up and you have to prove that you earned that you improved economic growth, you reduced poverty in your province. So in order to move up the chain, you get sent to a province, you get sent to a rural area, find job opportunities, build infrastructure, raise people out of poverty. If you do well there, you go to a higher level. Whereas in the US, how do you be a politician? You become famous, you become a reality TV host, you become a billionaire, and then you fund your political campaign. So they're completely different societies. And the point I'm getting at is that in China, education is deeply valued in a way that's not superficial. In the US, they talk about the importance of education, but their government does not actually prioritize education in the way that in China, so many things are built around education that makes it a healthier society. And I think that's also why people tend to be much more well-informed.
Right.
About what's going on in the world.
No, for sure. Well, maybe one way to wrap this up is, if people in the West are interested to kind of go to these universities or look for what scholarships are available, what do they do? How do they, apply? Is it any different than applying to universities in the West, or is it a fairly simple process? Is there anything you can add on that to wrap things up?
Very simple.
Yeah.
You just go online, look up. Most of the top universities, they all have pages in English with programs in English. And, a lot of people, foreigners, they're going to be looking at the top universities, right? And there are so many good ones. And it's easy. Apply. You can contact them. One thing that I did learn that was a challenge, these are these small little things, is that, email is not really used that much in China.
No.
It's all WeChat.
Yeah.
So the best thing to do is actually to go through WeChat, but email works as well. It's all this information is available online. I do have a few pieces of advice that I thought about. My experience has been amazing. Yeah. I really don't have many critiques. Mm-hmm. People say, oh, well, you're just biased and you support China. But really, my experience, like your experience, has been great. And there's so many people. When I came here, politically, I already had a lot of ideas. And being here has only further strengthened my feelings about China. But there are a lot of people who come to China. They have no experience. They're not political. And their experience of living here, they're often business people, it actually makes them more political. I know we have a lot of friends like that who were not involved in politics. They didn't really care about the Chinese government or anything like that. They just wanted to do trade. They wanted to do business. And by being here and seeing genuinely how the Western media is constantly lying about China, how actually people's living standards have definitely improved. You've seen it in 16 years, how much the country's developed. It actually kind of makes you get involved in politics. I think that's your story, actually, right?
Yeah. Just seeing how different the reality was on the ground from what was being reported. That was a theme that went through a number of different topics, but with what happened in Hong Kong, the difference between what actually happened and how the Western media was reporting it, that was kind of what really pushed me to make content. And I think there's a lot of other people too, where they come over here. There are some people who come over and they're so stuck in their ways that they'll see whatever they want to see, but that's kind of the minority. There are people like that. But for the most part, if you were to look at it from a Western government perspective, they might say, they might listen to your story and say, oh, they came over here and suddenly became pretty political, that it was China that radicalized them, so to speak. But actually, it's the Western media that radicalizes you, because when you see it with your own eyes and then you see what Western media is saying about China, which is in complete contradiction from what you're seeing, that's what radicalizes you, especially when you think about how long has my media been lying to me about stuff like this. For some people, it infuriates them. Their whole worldview changes. And they say, I've been lied to my whole life. And so it's Western media that ends up radicalizing you when you finally see the truth on the ground. So I mean, even if people aren't interested to actually study here, just to come here to take a look, which is happening more and more now, is going to be something that probably happens more now, anyways. That the Xiaohongshu, debacle ended up giving people a small picture into what China was really like, and they're blown away.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, being here again, I came here already politically aware, but being here, and if you're not political, it can really be life changing.
Yeah,
because of that when you realize that so many things in the Western media are literally made up. They're completely fabricated. I mean, I'm not saying everything in the media is false in the West, but there are certain things like the social credit system does not exist. Completely false. There are things like that. And you get here, you're like, wow. But, wrapping up, I was saying that my experience has been genuinely very positive. Honestly, I would have two pieces of advice. There were things I didn't think about a lot before I came here that that if you're thinking about coming to China seriously, these are two things you would think about. First of all, it's kind of a minor thing, but it seems obvious. But China is obviously enormous. And if you're going to be studying in China, you're going to be in a huge city. You can maybe try to find a university in a smaller place, but even the smaller cities in China are enormous.
Yeah.
We're talking many of these cities are at least 10 million people, at least in the broader metropolitan area. So one thing to think about is that if you're not from a major city and you come to China, it's not really just the culture shock. It's the lifestyle change will be very shocking. Now, I lived in New York, so it's different, but I have friends who come from smaller countries or smaller cities, and that for them actually was bigger than the culture shock, was going from living in maybe a small town or living in a city of 1 million people, a few 100,000, and coming to like Beijing or Chongqing where you have tens of millions. That can be really overwhelming. It's something to think about. The other thing that I was prepared for that, but the thing I was not really prepared for and that I wish I had prepared for better is Chinese. So like I said, my program is in English, and if you are on the college campus, if you're at a university and you live on campus, I don't live on campus because I wanted a better experience, like more experience off, living in an apartment off campus. If you do want to just live on campus, it's kind of a bubble. You can get by with not knowing much Chinese. And I know a lot of foreign students, they even come here for a PhD for a few years, and they barely know Chinese. I personally don't like that because you really are limited in your experience of the country. You're in a little bubble, and you can live comfortably and on the university campus. But I wish before I came here that I had spent 2 years studying Chinese. You can do that. So we talked about, for instance, people who want to come to do a PhD, a master's, even undergrad. There are people who come here to do undergraduate degrees. There are many opportunities for that. But honestly, another option that I would recommend is to come here and spend 1 or ideally 2 years just studying Chinese. So I have friends I know, they study, you can do a program, it's like, for instance, 8 to noon every day, 4 hours Chinese Monday to Friday. So it's not full time, it's not like overwhelming, but it's like a part-time job, part-time studies, and you could really pick up Chinese. And I would recommend that for 1 or 2 years. I honestly wish I had done that before I came here, because I have been learning Chinese, but the problem is I'm doing it. When you're trying to do graduate work, you have your program, and I do my own work.
Your content creation,
and I'm trying to learn Chinese. What ends up happening is Chinese kind of goes down on the list of priorities. So I'm picking it up, but not as much as I had hoped. And the thing about China is that, like I said, if you are on a university campus, you can get by with English. But outside of the university campuses, and especially outside of the big cities, there are not a lot of English speakers. Right. So you really have to learn Chinese. It's not like if you're in Europe, everyone speaks English, right? In China, you have to learn Chinese. That's something that really... And obviously, you're in China, you learn Chinese, but that's the only kind of real piece of advice that I would give people that I really wish I had considered more before I came here.
Yeah, and then also because obviously there are tools available now. You can do translation on your phone and stuff like that, but that's going to rob you from being able to really learn Chinese also, because you have all these different tools you can rely on. Because when I got here, in 2008, there weren't many. I mean, there were things you could get, but they weren't very good. And so it forced me to just kind of learn. I didn't go specifically to learn, but I did have a lot of Chinese friends who didn't speak English, and I would always hang out with them. And I learned from just conversations and things like that.
And then your experience is much better.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, you can have these kinds of deep relationships and really understand what's going on. And if you really care about comparing the reality on the ground here from what's being said overseas or media, you really need to be able to obviously speak to people in the local language. But yeah, no, that's some good advice. I did mention, I did realize I mentioned Xiaohongshu quite a few times. I'm assuming that most people knew about that, but just in case, so you don't have to look it up afterwards, I was talking about the migration of with the TikTok ban. A lot of people ended up downloading an app called Xiaohongshu Red Book, which ended up
Red Note.
Red Note. They usually call
technically it literally means little red book,
Exactly.
but they translate it in English as red note.
Yeah, exactly. And so a bunch of people from the West have been interacting with people in China and being able to see what the real China looks like without the filters that existed, which do exist on Western social media to give you a pretty skewed view of things. So just in case anybody didn't know what that was about. But the next big step for people who perhaps went through that and ended up seeing that China is not what they expected is perhaps visiting here or even studying here. So I think they'll get a lot of really great information from Ben's experiences here. And I thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Daniel. I mean, I think people will also definitely benefit from hearing about your experience because, like I said, I've only been here a year and a half and with plans to be here several years, but you've been here 16 years, so
that's a long time. Yeah.
You have a lot to share, and that's why I'm glad you have this channel and you help, inform people. Because actually, meeting you, watching your videos, that was also a factor in me deciding to come to China as well.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, thanks again, and I hope everybody enjoyed that, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah, thanks.